Hello and welcome to this month's Let's Talk Wellbeing slot. And because recently we had Endometriosis Week, I think it was, I thought I would focus on endometriosis for this session. And I know that we are, I think it's a week late, so we're not even in the same month anymore as Endometriosis Week, but I still thought that it's a topic that's close to a lot of people's hearts. And so it's still definitely worth sharing. So bear with me. I'm going to play with the tech for a minute because I've got some slides to share with you. And I just want to get those up if I can. Let me just play around with. I had this working before where you could see more of the slides and less of me. Sorry, bear with me. I don't know if I can change this now that I'm actually live. No, it doesn't look like it. So it's important that you see the slides rather than me. And again, they may not be showing as well as I would have hoped. So again, my lack of tech experience, technology knowledge perhaps showing here. But as I say, I wanted to look at endometriosis today. And as you probably know, this is a condition where tissue similar to the lining of the womb grows in other places. So outside of the womb itself, and it can be attached to other tissues such as the ovaries and the fallopian tubes. And this can affect women of any age, including teenagers. It's a long-term condition and it can have a significant impact on your life, but there are treatments that can help. This is the definition according to the NHS, nhs.uk. That's their perspective on endometriosis. And the symptoms can vary from person to person. So some women are more badly affected than others, and there are some who don't even have noticeable symptoms. But the most common symptoms of this condition are pain in your lower belly area or back, so pelvic pain effectively. And this is usually worse during the time of the month, the period time of the month. And that it can be bad enough to actually stop people wanting to take part in normal activities because they're just in too much pain, too much discomfort. Can also cause pain during or after sex and when using the toilet, particularly, again, during the period time. And again, this is all information from nhs.uk. Other symptoms can include feeling sick, constipation, diarrhea, or blood being passed in urine or feces as well during the period, and difficulty in getting pregnant. So this can be a huge factor in some cases of fertility. And some women also experience heavy bleeding during their periods and depression. Again, all information from the NHS website, which should be nhs.uk. So just to have a recap of the meta-consciousness perspective on what's happening during dis-ease. And this comes from the 5 natural laws of well-being that meta-consciousness follows. And they came from German New Medicine. Dr. Hammer discovered these laws in his research and his studies. And I share them in my book if you'd like to have a copy of the laws themselves. But one of the laws states that every dis-ease that we experience follows a 2-phase process. And that's basically what's shown in this diagram here, those 2 phases of dis-ease. The first, as you can see in red there, is known as the stress phase or the conflict active phase. And the second is regeneration, or sometimes also known as the healing phase. There are different names, but basically this is what those phases look like. This is what's being referred to. And if I just talk you through the diagram from left to right, which, as you can see, is time passing, and just to make a note as well that the up and down axis, the x-axis, I think, can't remember now, the how high the graph goes above the line or how deep it goes below the line indicates the intensity of that stress or of the experience of regeneration and healing. Because, as you may have heard me say before, during the stress phase, we don't tend to feel symptoms. Those come in the second phase. And if the stress has been particularly intense in the first phase, then our symptoms will be more intense in the second phase. So what do we feel like during the first phase? In that time, we often experience things like very restless, feeling quite active, and we might not sleep very well. We might not have much appetite, or we could be craving things like sugary foods and caffeine drinks, because those are the quick energy fixes. And when we're in stress, that is fight or flight. And so we need that quick, sharp boost of energy to help us either fight for our lives or flee, run away. And as you might gather from that description, this phase is meant to be quite active. It's meant to be a short, sharp burst. So we fight for our lives or we run away. And we're only meant to be in that kind of state, that sympathetic active state, for about 10 to 15 minutes at a time. But unfortunately for us humans now in the 21st century, many of us don't face those kind of in-your-face threats on a daily basis. So not the big tiger or lion jumping out from behind a rock or chasing us, which we can use the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol and all of those things that are pumping through our system, pushing us into fight or flight, to take action and do something to save ourselves, which allows us then to process the emotions, process the chemicals, the hormones that are running around in our body, and allows that all to pass on through, do what it's meant to do in that short, sharp burst, and then we can let it go. But for many of us now, our stresses are maybe more along the lines of tech. For me, you probably heard me say before that tech is a big stress for me. And recently it was working on one of my websites, my speaker website, and I just could not get it to do what I wanted it to do. And I was practically tearing my hair out. But all of those adrenaline, cortisol hormones that were rushing around in my system, preparing me to fight or to flee, weren't helping me. And the fact that the ways that I could try to address the problem, the issue, the challenge with my website weren't active in that sense, they weren't physically active, meant that those hormones had nowhere to go. They were just rushing around in my system and making me feel quite uncomfortable. But thankfully, knowing that, I could get up and go out and go for a walk or do something active, just move around, allow my body to start processing, start using those hormones for the intention that they were created, and then also to start shifting and exploring and processing, working through all of the emotions that were coming up for me. And I'm sharing a little bit about that next week in a post here in the group. So all of those sensations and experiences that we go through during stress phase, the restlessness, the lack of sleep, insomnia, maybe waking up at that witching hour, 3-4 o'clock in the morning and not able to get back to sleep, the cravings for sugar and caffeine drinks and all that high energy stuff, it all has a purpose. And the purpose is to help us find a solution. Wakefulness, insomnia, so that we have a longer period of time awake and therefore to think about and to come up with a solution. The restlessness, because we're active and we need to take action. Sadly, in the world we live in today, our hormone system maybe hasn't got the memo that that isn't the most appropriate support approach for most of the kinds of stresses and pressures that we face. But when we understand that, we can start to use the hormones and the energy and the activity in ways that are more supportive. The energy cravings, the sugar foods, the caffeine drinks, as I said, the purpose of that is to give us that energy to fight for our lives or to flee. Again, maybe not what's most appropriate for our lives today in the 21st century, but having that awareness can really support us and just allow us to understand and be compassionate towards ourselves when we find ourselves reaching for that chocolate biscuit, or we find ourselves unable to get back to sleep when we've woken up at 3-4 o'clock in the morning, or all of those other sorts of feelings, sensations, experiences that we're going through during that stress phase. But in that period of time, we can't afford to feel ill. We can't afford to feel pain, because if we did, we wouldn't be able to do that fight or flight. We wouldn't, if somebody hit us and we just went down with our bloody nose and were crying with the pain, we wouldn't be able to keep fighting. If we stubbed our toe while we were running away and just ended up hopping around in circles, that wouldn't save us from that chasing big cat that's coming up behind us. So we numb ourselves out with the adrenaline and the cortisol, because adrenaline is like epinephrine. It's that thing that dentists give us, which is why you can sometimes have a little bit of a flutter of the heart when you get your injections at the dentist. I know I certainly do. But that's the purpose of those hormones, to help us to do what we need to do in order to survive. Just that they haven't got the memo. We're not living in, most of us, not living in an environment where we're going to be chased by a big cat. But then something happens at 4 in this diagram that takes us out of stress and pushes us into regeneration or healing phase. And that's where we tend to experience our symptoms. So things like inflammation, heat, fever, rashes, itches, those things happen. I know that we tend to think of them as symptoms of disease, signs of sickness, but they're actually, generally speaking, not 100%. Some pain also happens in the stress phase when things have been ongoing for some time. But generally speaking, when we experience those symptoms, pain, flu-like symptoms, aches and pains, inflammation, feeling sick, those sorts of things, they are in regeneration. The healing peak at 6 sends us very briefly back into the energy of the stress phase, and it can have its own particular symptoms too. Part 7 on the diagram, the second part of the healing phase, is about restoration. It's about our body recovering its energy, rebuilding the losses that it may have experienced earlier on in the process. And this is where we might crave nutritious foods. So where they talk about chicken broth or a good hearty stew, or maybe in the summer you'd like fresh salad full of vegetables and maybe some fruits. We've got all of those colors that each are giving you different nutrients, different minerals, different vitamins, and you just crave all of that really healthy stuff when you're in that phase. And I tend to think of it as well as what the Victorians used to do, convalescence. And unfortunately, we don't do that so much these days. We don't go for fresh air cure to the seaside or to the mountains as they used to do years ago. And that's really to our detriment, because what we need in the restoration phase, and why our bodies experience these symptoms and the signs of fatigue and exhaustion and no energy, is to encourage us to rest, to take the time, to give ourselves the space to work through that part of the process, which is basically our body detoxing. It's processing and getting rid of all of the stuff it no longer needs on many levels, mind, body, and spirit. So the beliefs we've been carrying that haven't served us, the changes our body has made to cope with the stress phase that we no longer need. We need to get back to balance. So there are things that changes the body has made that we now need to undo. And one little snippet that I'll pop in here for you to think about or to come and learn about with me are that the microbes that we often blame, because we live with the germ theory by and large in our Western medical teachings, germ theory says that germs cause disease. But from a meta-consciousness perspective, we flip that around and say, actually, they don't. And it's that thing of cause and effect. They're there. Absolutely, they're there when we're experiencing disease and all of these symptoms. But they're there in synchronicity with us, in synergy with us. They are supporting us. They are our allies. They are our cleanup crew. They are our restoration crew. And if that is something that you find hard to get your head around, to believe, to accept, or you're really curious and you want to know more, then come and join me on my next Unlocking Healing Wisdom workshop, which is coming up on the 19th to 21st of this month, April. And you'll see more about that in my posts. There's one that's gone out today, and there'll be one going out next week as well to share more about that workshop. And there are a few places left. If you want to know more, just PM me or ask questions if you want to know a little bit more before you actually go ahead and buy a ticket. But yes, in the restoration phase, it's where we tend to experience the symptoms that we think of as symptoms of disease, but generally they're just our body going through its natural process. It's a very normal, very natural, very actually healthy process for us to go through that. Admittedly, not very comfortable, but the intensity will be a reflection of the intensity of the stress. So when we understand that, when we can spot, notice, identify when we're in stress and what the stress is we're experiencing, and take steps to address that and to reduce it where we can, to process it where we can rather than holding on to it, that means that we're less likely to experience extreme, severe, pronounced symptoms of healing, symptoms that we think of as being sick. So you may have identified from what I shared about the symptoms of endometriosis, where those are to be found on this diagram. They are, a lot of them, in the regeneration phase. Having said that, endometriosis is a chronic condition. This diagram in isolation is just an acute part of that process. So sometimes we might have a one-off, short, sharp illness. We might have a cold. We might have the flu, rather than an ongoing chronic condition such as fibromyalgia, ME, long COVID. And in that short, sharp process, that is what's reflected in this diagram. But if it's an ongoing process, I have another diagram later which I'll show you. But just for now, to say that, generally speaking, the symptoms of dis-ease are in that second phase, or the symptoms we think of as dis-ease are in that second phase. So what's going on in endometriosis? What is the meta-consciousness perspective of this particular dis-ease? We start by looking at which tissue, not even just organs. Sometimes we break the organs down into each specific tissue because organs may have more than one, such as the stomach or the heart. But here we're just looking at the ovaries. And they come under the brain relay of the cerebral medulla. There are 4 relays, 4 or 5 relays in our brain: the brain stem, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the cerebral medulla, and the cerebral cortex. And each one has a particular theme, which helps us in identifying what's going on when we're experiencing particular symptoms. And each brain relay, as it's developing when we're an embryo in our mother's womb, will be developing alongside of particular tissues in our body. And while the cerebral medulla is developing, the ovaries are also developing, or while the ovaries are developing, the cerebral medulla is developing. And they are very strongly connected. And this plays out in how our body interprets the stresses we experience and responds to those stresses. And here, for the ovaries, the general theme is profound loss. And it can also include fear or anticipation of that depth of profound loss. So that might be the loss of a parent when you're very small, the loss of a very close friend, which can include an animal. Because when, like, for example, myself, when I grew up, there was a dog who was like Nana from Peter Pan for me. She was my best friend. We went everywhere together. We played together. I told her all my secrets, all of my woes. So she was my confidant. And when she died, that hit me hard. So something like that could be the profound loss that affects the ovaries. And a theme here is ongoing, constant, continuous self-blame, grief, despair, that loss. And it can be following a breakup, or a death, or a miscarriage, or a really intense argument that may have resulted in the sense of a loss of the partner that you argued with, the friend that you argued with, the sibling or parent, that kind of argument that you just cut all ties. And there is that deep loss of friendship, loss of support, loss of how your life used to be and how your life might have been if they were still in it. There may be a strong sense of betrayal, of somebody being unfaithful to you, betraying your trust. And as I said, the loss of a loved one, which can include pets and animals in your life as well, if they're very close to you and really important and strong bond with them. It can also be for women who are trying, wanting desperately to get pregnant, but not feeling that they're in a good situation currently for bearing or raising a child. So that might be, for example, in a war situation where it just doesn't feel safe. Maybe there are bombs going off around you. Maybe you're a refugee. Maybe you don't have enough food and you're living in some kind of temporary shelter. None of that would feel like a safe place in which to give birth to, let alone raise a child. Or it might be that your relationship, the relationship you're in currently, is not feeling safe. That can result in miscarriage. That can result in this sense of profound loss and inability to give birth to that child that you so desperately long for. So the emotions behind endometriosis are grief, deep, profound grief, and despair and loss. Thoughts that could come up might be, how can I go on? How can I go on without that person in my life? How can I go on without the child that I long for? Somehow I must survive, or somehow we, that might be as a family or even as a culture, as a nation, as a people, somehow we need to find a way to survive. So the body is desperately wanting that, and it responds by trying extra hard, and that can lead to changes within that stress phase. Because, as I said, there's always a purpose to what the body is doing. And here it's just trying to support survival of self, of family, or of even greater, the people that you belong to, your community, your nation, your culture, your community, depending on the sense of the threat and the feeling that you're getting from that. During that stress phase, the changes that the body is making are cell loss, necrosis, cell death within the ovary, which results in a lowering of estrogen levels. Because if there are fewer cells, less tissue within the ovary, then there is less production of those that estrogen hormone, and so its level within the body, within the blood, decreases. And that can lead to irregular periods. So there may be irregular periods during that stress phase. So not all symptoms that we might think of as being signs of something not right in the body are in the regeneration phase. They can also be in the stress phase. And this is one example. In the early regeneration phase, so part 5, if you remember on that diagram, 4 is where we shift out of stress and into regeneration. 6 is the healing peak. And in between those is that first phase of regeneration. And here, the lost tissue, what was lost during that cell death, that necrosis, that cell loss in the stress phase, is replenished. And this is where the bacteria come in as our allies. And ideally, that replenishment is assisted by bacteria such as Streptococcus, as it says on the slide. The symptoms of this, what I was explaining earlier, are quite typical symptoms of regeneration and that healing phase of the process are pain, inflammation, and swelling. And you'll see that kind of symptom as well when you have, say, a cut. And I often think of a cut because it's quite a surface level healing process that we can see with our eyes. This, obviously, with endometriosis and the ovaries, is internal. We can't see it. We might be able to feel things. We might feel changes in our body, feel unwell perhaps, but we can't see what's going on. A cut, you can. And if you think of a cut, when it's healing, what's happening? It goes red, it swells, it's inflamed. You can feel heat from it. And then as that progresses, it starts to get itchy. And my mom always used to say, you know, when it's itchy, that it's healing. So all of those symptoms are healing symptoms. And you'll see it in other conditions as well, such as eczema. When you have a flare-up of eczema, it's red, it's hot, it's itchy. And we think of that as being stress-induced. But actually, the stress was beforehand. And it's during the healing phase, when the body's trying to heal. Eczema is another chronic condition, and I'll be talking more about chronic conditions in a moment. But it is actually the body trying to heal when we're experiencing these symptoms, just as it would be if you were to see them on a cut on the surface of your body. As the regeneration goes on, there is the formation of an ovarian cyst in the area where the cell loss, the necrosis occurred. That's where the cyst forms. And if you're also experiencing a sense of isolation or abandonment or feeling like a refugee, remember I was talking earlier about if you are a literal refugee, where you might be living, having fled a war zone perhaps, or famine or whatever, and you're living perhaps in temporary shelter and feeling very unsafe, then that can result in that refugee status, that refugee feeling. But we can also just feel like a fish out of water. And it might be that you move to a new area, you don't know anyone yet, you don't have that sense of community, or it can be that you're in your community or even in your family, as we talked about earlier, and you've had maybe a row and an argument and it's left you feeling cut off from your previous network and community. Those sorts of feelings. Or maybe just in your family, you've never felt seen. You've never felt heard for you. That can lead to that sense of isolation and abandonment. And when we have that sense, then our body holds water. But again, there is a purpose to the body holding water. It's not doing it randomly, it's doing it for a reason. And when we look at kind of our evolutionary process, we'll understand why. When we were hunter-gatherer peoples, maybe living in caves or in small communities, small groups, we relied so much on one another. So there would be somebody who knew how to find water. There would be somebody who led the hunt and was a skilled hunter or a skilled forager, or knew how to climb a tree to get the honey from the bees. And each person would have their own skills and their own contribution to the community. But if we feel isolated, abandoned, alone, a refugee with no support, we are potentially less likely to find those things that we need, those necessities, those basic necessities for life, water, food, shelter. We are less likely to find them on our own because we're only one set of eyes, one set of legs, one ability to go out there and forage or hunt or climb the tree and get the honey. So to give us more time, because we're never going to be more than one person. So having more time might allow us more opportunity, more possibility and potential of finding those resources that we need. And to do that, the body stores fuel in the form of fat. So when we're stressed, we store fat as well, and water. And it will hold on to that water within our tissues. So we can see swelling. And if we have got to this point where an ovarian cyst has formed, cysts are full of water. So when our body is storing water, it can store water there too, because it tends to store the water particularly in the area that's been affected by the stress. When that happens, the cyst will enlarge, it will swell. And that can cause considerable pain, because if you think it's inside of our body and it's growing where there isn't any space, so it's pushing on surrounding tissues, and that causes pain, particularly during menstruation. And it may also result in heavy bleeding. And these cells, these cysts are growing cells in order to replace the cells that were previously lost. So the cyst is swelling, it's full of cells that are designed to put back what has been lost during the stress phase. And at the healing peak, so 6 in that diagram, that short, sharp blip where we go back into the energy of stress, during that time, and the purpose of that part of the diagram is to push out the water that our body no longer needs. It's done what it was meant to do, and we're ready to release it now so that we can carry on and finish off that healing. So it pushes that water out. It pushes it out of the cyst so that it can be released from the body. And if the cyst is not activated again, if it's not reactivated, then that fluid will disappear. It'll be taken away by the body in its own very natural healing processes. And the cyst will therefore shrink back down and it will harden. And it becomes a part of the normal hormone producing function of the tissue, the ovary. because it has those cells that were created within that cyst for that purpose, to replace the cells that were lost in the stress phase. And similar to a pregnancy, don't you just love how neat the body is? If this process is uninterrupted, it takes 9 months in order to go from the formation of that cyst all the way through all of these steps to the end, to the cyst going back down to a small hardened piece of tissue that is back just producing the hormones that the ovaries are designed to produce. So the biological purpose of this whole process is to boost the estrogen level of the woman so that she appears more attractive, and it increases her readiness to mate, which is answering that whole fear that the woman had earlier, that how am I going to survive? Somehow I must find a way that I survive, that my genes are passed on, that my family survives, my community survives, my people survive, on whatever level she was feeling that pressure and that stress. The body is going through a biological response to that. So through this process, in the second part, the first part, there was cell death, so her estrogen levels were lowering. But in the second part, her estrogen levels are rising again, so that she's more able to find a mate and to bear children and to accomplish what it was that she so longed to accomplish, what she so longed to achieve. And this is very common in this particular brain relay, the cerebral medulla, that the purpose of the body is achieved in this second phase, in this regeneration phase. I said I would talk about chronic conditions, and that's what's represented here in this diagram. In the earlier one, you saw that there was the red phase, and it was pretty much mirrored by the green phase, and then returning to health at the end of the healing process. However, if when the body has gone into regeneration, it's not able to go through and complete that process, something happens that re-triggers and pushes us back into stress, then it ends up looking a bit like this. We keep going into stress, out of stress, into stress, out of stress, into stress, out of stress. And that is a chronic condition. So something like fibromyalgia, diabetes, chronic, long COVID, these chronic fatigue, these conditions are following this process. Something is pushing us back into stress. And I know that trigger is a sensitive word for some people, but I love Gabor Mate's description of trigger and re-triggering, because he says that if you think about a gun or a weapon of any kind, the trigger is such a small part of that weapon. It's not actually the bit that does the damage, that causes the bullet to be fired out through the barrel. That's the explosive part. So the trigger is the thing that reminds us of something. The explosive part is the emotion and the intensity of that emotion that we are still carrying within our body somewhere. So here, if there is a fear, if there is that sense of profound loss, and I haven't been able to process it, I'm still carrying it in my body. Here, it'll be carried in the ovaries and in the cerebral medulla. If I haven't been able to release that, it's still held within me, still able to be brought back into a fully active state, then this can happen, this chronic condition, because something can happen that brings back that sense of loss, that brings back that sense of isolation, abandonment, being a fish out of water, being cut off from my family, not being able to survive because of that depth of loss, not being able to go on. And when that keeps getting re-triggered and reactivated, it pushes us back into stress. And then something may come along and help us to process a part of that stress again. Or we just get to that point where, excuse my French, we say, fuck it. I just can't push any longer. I can't fight any longer. I have no more energy left. I give up. And at that point, that in itself can shift us even temporarily into that regeneration phase. And then if we get re-triggered, back we go again. And until we can process that deep, profound loss that we're holding on to in our bodies, it'll always be there. However, with meta-consciousness, with understanding this whole process, with knowing what our symptoms are, what's going on in the body, we can start to take appropriate steps. If somebody has endometriosis, we know now what it relates to. We can start addressing that sense of profound loss or that fear of profound loss, that anticipation of that loss. If it's that type of anticipatory grief, because it doesn't have to have already happened. And it doesn't have to be something that outsiders would think of as being profound loss. It's very personal. It's very subjective. So if you are somebody who experiences endometriosis or you know somebody, be aware that as the person yourself, you might think nobody else thinks that's a big deal and I shouldn't feel that way. But that's not the case. If you feel that way, you feel that way. And if you know somebody who has endometriosis and they tell you something, please don't dismiss it and say, but that's nothing. For example, some people don't have a close relationship to a pet. And if another person says, I'm grieving for the loss of my dog or my hamster or my goldfish, if that's that strong an intense an emotion for them, that's how it is. And to support them, we need to accept and appreciate and understand that that's how it is for them. That's their perception of what's happening in their life. That's their pain. So endometriosis is a chronic condition. It's going on over time because we have this energy of pain and loss in our body. But when we can address that, we can let it go, we can allow our body to complete this healing process and come out the other end and experience greater well-being and a freedom from all of those symptoms. So how does the endometriosis part actually come about? So far, we've just talked about what's going on early part of that, or in the kind of acute initial stages of the dis-ease. Sorry, if you hear a ringing tone, somebody is calling me while I'm on this live, and I'm not able to turn it off because it's on the computer, and I can't access that while I'm on this. So I hope it'll finish soon, or that you can't hear it. When the condition becomes chronic, that cyst, if it's swelling and swelling and swelling, can actually reach the point where it bursts. And that can be due to us feeling so isolated and abandoned that we hold water and just more water and more water and more water. So that cyst is just getting bigger than it can hold, and it bursts. Something else that can cause that cyst to burst is an impact. So a blow to the abdomen. So an accident perhaps, or a fall, or sometimes if we go to the medical profession, they want to explore what's going on, what's within that cyst. They want to do maybe elimination tests to see, is it cancerous? What's going on in there? And if we do that prematurely, so we maybe have premature surgery, we go in there to see what's in, we maybe do a needle aspiration, we take some cells out of that cyst, it may cause it to rupture and to burst. And remember that I said within the cyst there are new ovarian cells. Those cells, the aim of the body, the biological purpose behind those cells is to replace the ones that were lost in the stress phase when there was necrosis and cell death. So those cells are meant to be there. But if the cyst gets so big, or there's an accident or a blow or whatever causes that cyst to rupture, those cells will escape. They'll come out of the cyst and they can go out, because if you have a cyst that's actually attached to the wall of the uterus and the womb, if that bursts going outwards, those cells can then get out into the abdominal cavity. And it can attach to other organs. So that's where you can get the endometriosis tissue on the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, etc., as I mentioned earlier. And that can cause cyst development on the outside, as well as, I was saying it can burst through the wall of the uterus, but it's the wall of the ovary. But that can cause then the cyst development to be on the outside as well. And that's when it is diagnosed as endometriosis. That's basically what that means, as I mentioned in the symptoms at the beginning. And according to conventional Western medicine, they say that endometriosis is a growth of endometrial tissue outside of the uterus. So it's designed to be inside this particular tissue, but here they're saying that it's growing on the outside. However, brain scans show the typical ring structure forms that we see in stress phase. So when we have stress phase, I was saying it impacts on a tissue, but also part of the brain. And you can see it in the brain. When you take a CT scan, it shows up like a set of concentric rings. And for endometriosis, those rings are in the area of the brain that relates to the ovary, not the uterus itself. And that explains also why endometriosis results in a woman's hormones, estrogen production going up rather than going down. And the purpose, remember, of that is so that she becomes more attractive and more open to finding a mate and to producing children. So that is the end of this presentation on endometriosis. I hope that it has given you some insights, some understanding, maybe a different perspective that you haven't come across before. Hopefully a perspective that is more empowering and that gives you more of a sense of understanding why might the body do this? What is the purpose behind it? There's always a purpose. As Gabor Mate says, it's that the body has made an adaptation. So when we can understand why it has felt the need to make this adaptation, what the adaptation is designed to achieve, how that might support us, because the strategies that our body is using are always very wise, intelligent, logical strategies when we understand what they are a response to. However, in the long term, they might not be supporting us. So when we see symptoms and we can pick them apart, unpack them, as I've done here with endometriosis, then we can see, what support do I need? If I have endometriosis, the support I need is around that sense of profound loss I'm carrying. support to help me to work through that, to process it, to release it, to know that I am okay, I will survive. My family, my nation will survive. We are surviving. And to work through that, and that's not to say necessarily it might be age related, it might be other issues as well that mean I'm not necessarily going to go on and have children myself, but we can release the sense of loss around that. And when that happens, when we can see how life still does go on, maybe in other ways, there are lots of avenues to explore for that. Maybe I can be a parent role in another way, or a grandparent role, or whatever that might be. But just to find other ways of expressing the part of us that needs to be expressed, of addressing our pain and releasing it, then that creates the environment in which our body can thrive. Like the plant, if it's not doing well, we don't blame the plant. We look at, does it need more water, less water? Does it need more food, less food? More light, less light? What conditions does it need to thrive? And it's the same for ourselves. What conditions do we need to thrive? What pressures do we currently feel? And how can we start to put things in place that relieve those pressures, that take them off so that we can breathe, so that we can stretch, so that we can stand tall and strong? So I hope that's been helpful. And if you have any questions, please do either pop them below in the comments or get in touch with me if you prefer just to message me privately. And if you have any other conditions that you're curious about, maybe something you experience yourself or that is in your family, or you know people who have had a condition that you're interested in, then again, just pop me a message and I'm very happy to explore things and to share the meta perspective to start this conversation. That's really what these sessions are for, and that's why I call them Let's Talk Wellbeing, just to start these conversations, just to see how can we come from a more empowered perspective and be able to take back agency over our well-being and our life. Because certainly for myself, years ago, I was diagnosed with ME, borderline fibromyalgia, borderline diabetes. I did not have a good relationship with my body. I felt it was letting me down and it was working against me and all of those sorts of beliefs. And I also wasn't getting an awful lot of help understanding from the medical profession. I know things have moved on, but unfortunately now the situation is that it's very difficult to make an appointment with your GP. If you need further investigations, further support, quite often it's a long waiting list. I know of people who've been waiting years for operations. But if we can take action to support ourselves now, then perhaps we won't need an operation, or we will be in a better place for that operation when the time comes. So do please let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to explore, any other conditions, or if you've got any questions on endometriosis, just pop me a line. And I wish you a very happy weekend. I hope we get a little bit of sunshine. The weather here has been that sort of changeable April weather, showers, sunshine, showers, sunshine. But yeah, it's nice to see the longer days, the longer evenings here in the UK. So hopefully a good weekend ahead, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.